Within 36 hours, a message would cross the Allied command like a fuse. Field Marshal formally asked General Dwight D. Eisenhower to sack George S. Patton. Behind the terse words lay more than a demand for discipline. It was a collision of styles, national pride, press timing, and the raw politics of coalition warfare. For Eisenhower, the choice that followed, how to respond to a British commander demanding the removal of one of America's most famous generals, would force a reckoning between order and results, propriety and momentum, unity and the very personalities that had produced victory. March 1945, the war in Western Europe was rushing towards its conclusion, but the final months possessed their own dangers. The Allies still needed to cross the Rhine, break into the heart of Germany, and prevent reconstitution of coherent resistance. For Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, Operation Plunder was designed to be the decisive, textbook crossing. It was to be massive, precise, and public, a vindication of meticulous planning after the costly errors and public embarrassment of Market Garden months earlier. Montgomery's plan would marshal 80,000 men, supported by thousands of artillery pieces. Witnesses and later reports emphasized the sheer scale: tens of thousands of troops, 5,000 artillery guns arrayed to pound the far bank into submission. The operation would be staged with methodical buildup and overwhelming firepower. Winston Churchill intended to be on hand to observe what Montgomery presented as the definitive Allied river assault. Montgomery's calculus was not merely operational. He wrote and spoke in terms that fused military logic with reputation. After Market Garden's failure, which had left lingering questions about British airborne operations and Montgomery's judgment, Plunder carried an extra burden. It was an opportunity to put British planning back on a pedestal in the public eye and to demonstrate to both Allies and neutrals that large-scale, coordinated offensives could be cleanly executed. In his world, operations were a product of careful preparation and centralized direction. The crossing would be a spectacle of combined arms, engineers, assault infantry, armored support, artillery barrages, and airborne drops, synchronized to the minute. To Montgomery, discipline and adherence to the plan were as vital as the plan itself. Yet while Montgomery arranged for canvas and cordite to be choreographed, an opportunity elsewhere was quietly unfolding that would unsettle his script. South of the main approaches Montgomery favored, near the town of Oppenheim on the Rhine, elements of General George S. Patton's Third Army observed a weakness. German forces were thinner, their local dispositions uncertain. Patton's reputation rested on speed, audacity, and a willingness to seize transient chances. Where Montgomery saw risk, Patton saw leverage. On the night of March 22, 1945, according to reports and later reconstructions, Patton's troops moved quickly. A single American division, relatively modest compared to the tens of thousands Montgomery planned to commit, launched an opportunistic crossing at Oppenheim. Engineers and assault troops used canvas assault boats under cover of darkness, soldiers biting down on the cold run of a river in a silent night, and a bridgehead was secured in hours rather than days. Pontoon bridges followed soon after. Engineers worked round the clock to bring armor and vehicles across. Within a remarkably short span, the Americans expanded the lodgment, established supply lines, and moved forces across the river. Casualty figures associated with that crossing are reported to have been low, under 100 in some accounts, while the speed of the operation and the rapid construction of bridges suggested a level of execution that confounded the expectation that only Montgomery's grand scheme could produce a secure crossing. Patton's action had multiple effects. Tactically, it established a usable avenue for Allied forces into Germany sooner than Montgomery had planned in the north.
Symbolically, it upstaged an operation that Montgomery had framed not simply as a military necessity, but as a ceremonial act of British-led triumph, with Churchill as spectator. And politically, the timing was combustible. Patton's success arrived in the public eye before Montgomery's much larger crossing could take center stage. In coalition warfare, perception can be as influential as an extra 100 artillery pieces. A bold stroke that captures headlines shifts attention, reputation, and sometimes resources. How the news moved mattered. Patton, by temperament and history, was not a secretive man. He reported his successes upward. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th U.S. Army Group and Patton's senior American colleague, received word of the Oppenheim crossing and, according to contemporary accounts, made a pragmatic call. Bradley authorized that the crossing be released to the press in a way that would assure American newspapers had the story. In a media environment where immediacy was beginning to shape public understanding of the war, timing a press release mattered as much as sending an operational after-action report. Bradley's decision to let American outlets publish the news ensured that Patton's daring would command domestic headlines, an outcome that both lifted morale at home and, intentionally or not, rubbed raw certain Allied sensitivities. British and American newspapers did not cover the crossing the same way. In the United States, the image of Patton's men in canvas boats, soldiers biting down on the cold run of a river in a silent night, became a compelling visual that editors relished. Headlines favored the audacity of an American commander who simply acted and delivered.
In Britain, coverage was more measured, reflecting both different editorial priorities and a vested interest in Montgomery's planned operation. The contrast in reportage fed the rivalry between commanders already present in many officers' minds, that Patton's style of opportunistic aggression would receive disproportionate public adulation, while Montgomery's painstaking planning, intended to produce a near irreproachable victory, might appear overshadowed or redundant. Montgomery saw the matter differently. To him, Patton's move was not the corrective of a plan's delay, it was a breach of discipline and a challenge to coalition coordination, a unilateral stroke that had public consequences for an operation designed to be joint and controlled. For Montgomery, the integrity of coordinated planning was not an abstract concept. It was essential to preventing friendly interference, miscommunication, and the risking of lives for the sake of headlines. The British commander reportedly described the action as very American, a shorthand both for frustration and for a critique of what he perceived as American willingness to prioritize initiative over coalition protocols. That phrase, reported by contemporaries, reveals the national undercurrents. British military culture prized methodical control. American commanders, in Montgomery's view, sometimes privileged audacity. On March 26th, Montgomery took the extraordinary step of sending a formal recommendation to Eisenhower, asking that Patton be relieved of command. The message was not a casual expression of annoyance, it was a documented insistence that the breach in discipline demanded corrective action at the highest level. Montgomery's appeal to Eisenhower leaned on several pillars: the need to uphold the principle of coordinated planning in a multinational alliance, the danger of commanders acting independently in ways that could disrupt broader operations, and the perceived affront to British efforts that the premature publicity represented. By lodging a formal request for relief, Montgomery elevated a professional dispute into the realm of supreme command decision-making. That message landed on a desk already laden with complexities. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, carried responsibility for both military outcomes and the fragile balance of coalition politics.
He had to weigh not only the operational facts, Patton's bridgehead, the number of troops moved, the casualty totals, but also the potential political consequences in the United States and Britain, the morale effects among Allied soldiers, and the practical realities of keeping the final offensive moving without internal disruption. In the coming hours, he would have to reconcile competing imperatives, justice and discipline on one hand, utility and momentum on the other. The raw figures sharpened the dilemma. Montgomery had marshaled an enormous effort. Reports referenced the 80,000 men intended for plunder and some 5,000 artillery pieces arrayed to shape the battlefield. Patton's Oppenheim crossing, by contrast, was executed by roughly a single division operating with assault boats and engineers, small in scale, yet disproportionate in publicity. Casualty estimates associated with the two approaches, Montgomery's larger crossing purportedly incurring something on the order of 500 casualties in preliminary phases in some accounts, compared to figures reported as under 100 at Oppenheim, further complicated the moral arithmetic. Would a commander who had preserved lives and delivered a rapid bridgehead be punished for doing exactly what wartime commanders are supposed to do, exploit weakness and accelerate victory? Or would tolerating such behavior erode the coalition's disciplined coordination and invite future unilateral actions with less favorable consequences? Beyond arithmetic lay personal reputations and public perception. Patton's celebrity in the United States was not merely about the crossings, it was about the narrative Americans liked to tell themselves, a hard-charging leader who delivered swift results. Montgomery had his own domestic constituency in Britain and among Commonwealth officers, and his priority was restoring a sense of British competence and prestige after Market Garden. The press, both American and British, was an active participant in this contest for the public story of the war. What one newspaper framed as heroic, another could depict as reckless. In the cramped world of coalition command, public narratives could translate into real pressure on policy and promotions. Eisenhower's position required careful navigation. He was, by temper and training, predisposed to weigh a variety of factors and to frame decisions that preserved alliance cohesion. He had to consider Bradley's role. As Patton's immediate superior and an American commander, Bradley had privately and publicly sought to temper disputes and to keep field commanders focused on results. Bradley's pragmatic authorization to release the Oppenheim story to the American press was a consequential act, one that made the problem as much a political moment as an operational misstep. Removing Patton would have had immediate repercussions in the American press and possibly on American troop morale. Retaining him in command risked affirming a permissive environment for unilateral action. For Eisenhower, neither option was free from downstream costs. The coalition element stenciled the stakes. Eisenhower commanded forces from several nations. British sensitivities were not academic. They affected cooperation on housing, supply, and intelligence. If British commanders felt their tactical integrity could be routinely undercut by American initiative, they might balk at future coordinated operations or insist on stricter control mechanisms. At the same time, American political leaders and public opinion, still deeply invested in the conduct of their own troops, were a counterweight that Eisenhower could not ignore. In short, Eisenhower faced a trilemma: how to uphold coalition discipline, how to honor battlefield success that materially advanced the Allied cause, and how to prevent public-spirited journalism from dictating command decisions. As the message from Montgomery made its way through Supreme Headquarters, the human drama remained visible in small vignettes. Soldiers who had been ferried in canvas boats at Oppenheim were already consolidating positions on the East Bank. Engineers were finishing pontoon bridges that would allow armor and supplies to flow. At headquarters, staff officers passed memos and casualty reports. The press office drafted and coordinated releases. Military couriers ran between tents under floodlights where maps were spread on tables. Churchill's planned attendance at plunder, an emblem of anticipated victory and pageantry, now took on an awkward resonance. The spectacle Montgomery sought to stage was being partially eclipsed by events farther south. There were whispers about motives. Some observers reported that Montgomery's insistence on relief sprang as much from wounded pride as from professional principle. Others, especially among British officers who had watched the fallout from Market Garden, felt Montgomery had a legitimate point. Coalition warfare required predictable, coordinated action, and unilateral moves, however successful in the short term, could create dangerous precedents. Facts could be marshaled on both sides. Patton's Oppenheim lodgment provided immediate tactical advantage, while Montgomery's exhaustive planning promised minimized losses in massed river assault. Neither perspective was purely emotional nor purely pragmatic. They were messy human judgments made under conditions of stress, incomplete information, and the urgency of final victory. The calendar supplied the hard anchors. March 22nd marked the Oppenheim crossing. March 26th carried Montgomery's formal recommendation to relieve Patton. March 28th loomed as the moment when Eisenhower's reply would be transmitted. That narrow window, 6 days from the initial move to the expected return, sharpened the drama. Within it, field operations continued, press cycles turned, and bureaucratic wheels at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, began to hum with urgent purpose. Eisenhower did not act in a vacuum. He convened staff, solicited assessments, and considered the manifold consequences of any hard decision. Those hours were not simply about whether a single general kept his command. They were about the precedent that decision would set for command autonomy, national honor, and alliance cohesion during the war's most decisive phase. Meanwhile, back in the public square, editorials and cartoons began to reflect the shifting narrative.
In American papers, images of Patton's operations were paired with headlines that celebrated speed and audacity. In Britain, the tone was more sober, sometimes defensive, and sometimes critical of what was presented as American impatience with coordinated planning. The international press war, as it were, fed directly into the commander's dispute. For Montgomery, the timing of the press coverage was an affront that made his private grievance public and forced an escalation to SHAEF. For Patton's backers, the press coverage validated a style of leadership that brought tangible results. Within SHAEF, registers of competence and politics interlaced. Eisenhower's staff compiled operational reports: how many troops had crossed at Oppenheim, what immediate gains had been made, the readiness of bridges for armor, and casualty rolls. At the same time, briefings addressed political sensitivities: which national governments would react to a relief order, how the American press might portray Eisenhower's action, whether British opinion would accept leniency if it preserved Allied effectiveness. Among these deliberations, Omar Bradley's position mattered. He had authorized the release of news about Oppenheim, and he was an important voice within the American command. Bradley had historically sought to preserve unity between British and American corps, and to prevent personal rivalries from fracturing the operational picture. His support for Patton in this instance was both a defense of his subordinate and a reflection of a broader American inclination to favor initiative. The competing conceptions of military professionalism lay bare.
Montgomery's model prized the carefully rehearsed, massed application of force, designed to eliminate surprise and risk. Patton's model prized initiative, speed, and exploitation of fleeting enemy weaknesses. Both models had produced successes, and both had produced failures. Operation Plunder's scale was, in Montgomery's words, and in the public imagination, the kind of operation best suited to ensure minimal unnecessary losses through overwhelming strength. Patton's Oppenheim crossing suggested that under certain conditions, bold, limited thrusts could achieve strategic advantage quicker, with fewer losses, and with a smaller footprint. Which model should inform command decisions when both were available? That was the strategic question Eisenhower faced, and it carried operational, political, and reputational dimensions. The exchange of formal messages crystallized the contest. Montgomery's recommendation to relieve Patton arrived as a document that made the dispute official rather than distributive. Eisenhower's staff prepared counsel. Some voices urged strict enforcement of command discipline, no tolerance for uncoordinated actions that could undermine planning.
Others urged caution, warning that removing an admired American general at a moment of success could provoke a domestic storm and risk undermining morale at a critical phase of the campaign. There were practical considerations, too. Patton had proven he could move fast. His forces were now in position to exploit German disarray. Would removing him hamper momentum in the days when speed might push the war toward a quicker end? As the 26th gave way toward the 28th, the situation acquired a strange mixture of routine and drama. Routine in the sense that SHAEF's staff processes, cables, memos, consultations moved in expected channels. Dramatic in the sense that reputations, the press, and national pride all fed into the technical calculus. Eisenhower, it was reported, took a broad view. He considered not simply the immediate infraction, but the entire strategic context. He listened to legalistic advisors and practical operations officers, to political liaisons concerned with Anglo-American relations, and to his American commanders who feared the domestic fallout of severe discipline. He evaluated the likely battlefield consequences of either removing Patton or allowing him to remain. He weighed how any decision would be interpreted in London and Washington, and how it would affect the final weeks of the campaign. For Montgomery, the clock ticked anxiously. His planned Operation Plunder would still proceed, but the presence of a competing narrative in the press and the open friction between him and Patton undermined the very spectacle he had hoped to stage. The television age had not yet arrived, but public narratives had already acquired power. Montgomery's insistence on relief was in part an attempt to reclaim the narrative, to assert the primacy of coordinated planning, and to make clear that unilateral actions, even when tactically successful, would not be tolerated if they endangered alliance unity or overshadowed Allied operations. For Patton, the world was different. His supporters emphasized results. A secure bridgehead, the movement of armor, and a theater of operations shifted in favor of the Allies. To them, discipline could not be blind to effectiveness. They worried that silencing initiative in the final months might delay victory, and they argued that commanders in the field must retain flexibility to seize openings the enemy leaves exposed. In their view, the Oppenheim crossing was an exemplary instance of initiative paying off. Punishing it risked discouraging the very kind of bold thinking that had repeatedly produced breakthroughs. Between those poles, Eisenhower stood with the responsibility to hold the alliance together while pursuing victory. The impending decision would be read not only as a judgment on one general's behavior, but as a test of Allied cohesion.
It would speak to whether the coalition would enforce a strict hierarchy of decision-making in the name of discipline, or whether Eisenhower would allow individual commanders latitude when results were manifest. The stakes were not merely reputational, they were practical.
The final stages of the war demanded that the Allies avoid internecine fights that might slow the advance or complicate supply and coordination. As March 28th approached, the corridors of SHAEF hummed with posted maps and whispered consultations. Dispatches from the field reported fresh gains. Press clippings arrived in bundles. Bradley and other American leaders prepared to defend their positions. Montgomery awaited a reply that could either vindicate his insistence on propriety or leave him to bear, publicly, a sense of being upstaged. The men who had manned the assault boats at Oppenheim were far from concerned with the politics above them. They were consolidating positions, moving ammunition, and preparing for the next push. Yet their actions, brief, dangerous, and decisive, had unexpectedly forced Eisenhower into a high-stakes decision that reached from frontline river currents to the offices of prime ministers and presidents. If discipline were the only yardstick, Montgomery's case had moral clarity. If effectiveness were the only yardstick, Patton's case had winning clarity. The question, how should a commander balance those considerations when the calculus includes coalition sensitivities and public opinion, did not yield an obvious answer. What makes this episode particularly resonant is that Eisenhower would have to provide one. Before any reply was typed and sealed, the theater still held surprises. The Rhine itself, a cold, relentless presence, had long been a symbol that separated the Allies from the German interior. Crossing it had symbolic gravity. The trees on the far bank, the smell of wet earth, the sound of pontoon planks being hammered into place, all evoked a moment when victory approached but was not yet secured. Each commander saw that bank through different lenses. Montgomery saw a stage for a grand, masterfully executed assault. Patton saw an opening to be widened with speed. Eisenhower saw a strategic horizon that required both unity and momentum. The choice he faced, how to respond to Montgomery's request for Patton's relief, was therefore as much about the kind of coalition the Allies would be through the war's last breath as it was about a single disciplinary case. And so the question remained, urgent and unresolved. Within those 36 hours implied by the title, would Eisenhower seize the opportunity to enforce coalition discipline by removing a contentious yet effective commander, or would he choose to accept the rough edges of audacity, because in that final push, results mattered above all? The cable traffic mounted, advisors leaned in, newspapers in 2 nations readied their next editions.
The decision that followed would ripple beyond the immediate actors, shaping how historians and participants would later understand the interplay between leadership, politics, and the art of command. Eisenhower's reply came not as an impulsive rebuke, nor as a perfunctory bureaucratic note. It was the product of a leader forced into rapid arbitration between competing professional claims and the practical necessities of a collapsing enemy. Between March 26th, when Montgomery's formal recommendation arrived, and March 28th, when the Supreme Allied Commander framed his answer, Schaeff's rooms filled with maps, memos, and earnest counsel. Staff officers moved among stacks of cables, political liaisons scanned press clippings, operations officers updated estimates of how far Patton's lodgment could be pushed in the coming days. The question Eisenhower had to answer was simple in form, but fiendishly complex in consequence. Enforce coalition discipline by removing a general accused of insubordination, or preserve a commander whose initiative had just yielded tangible advantage. Eisenhower approached the problem as he usually did, by broadening the frame.
He did not treat the Montgomery message as merely a complaint between professionals. He treated it as a test of what the Allied command could tolerate in its most fragile month. On the table were three intertwined registers: the military, the political, and the practical. Military considerations assessed immediate tactical value. Could Patton's bridgehead be expanded into a decisive exploitation? Political considerations asked how Washington and London would view a dramatic punishment of a nationally celebrated officer. Practical considerations asked whether removing Patton would cost momentum at a moment when speed could shorten the conflict and save lives. Staff discussions, as reported by contemporaries, ranged across those registers. Operations officers outlined the gains already secured at Oppenheim and projected what might follow if armor and supplies continued to cross the pontoon bridges being finished under floodlights. Counsel in the legal and administrative branches warned of the blowback that a relief order would cause among American troops and within the U.S. press corps. Political liaisons reminded Eisenhower that Anglo-American cooperation was not merely about shared maps, but about shared trust. If British commanders felt their carefully orchestrated plans could be routinely undermined by Allied units ignoring coordination, the quality of future cooperation could suffer. Senior American commanders argued that discipline mattered, but that discipline could not be applied in a way that crippled the Army's ability to exploit enemy weakness. Omar Bradley's role loomed especially large in these deliberations. He had authorized the release of the Oppenheim story in the American press, a judgment rooted in a desire to recognize success and to preserve morale.
He was also, by temperament and by duty, a unifier, inclined to accommodate the sometimes clashing sensibilities of senior colleagues in both armies. Bradley's practical view, patronizing Patton's success while urging that it not become a precedent for reckless independence, bore on Eisenhower's calculus. If Bradley, whose judgment Eisenhower trusted, saw value in retaining Patton, this could not be easily dismissed. At the same time, Eisenhower could not overlook the coalition dimension. Montgomery's complaint was not a private grumble between peers. It was a formal assertion by a senior commander that unilateral action by an Allied subordinate had compromised operational cohesion. British sensibilities in 1945 carried not only professional pride, but also political import. The British public and government wanted to see their commanders vindicated after the bitter memory of Market Garden. An impulsive American response that brushed aside British concerns might exacerbate Anglo-American tensions at a moment when supply, intelligence sharing, and cooperative planning were indispensable. Practical realities deepened the dilemma. The German front was crumbling in places, but stiff air defenses, flooded plains in others, and pockets of resistance meant that opportunities came and went. Removing a commander who had proven effective at exploiting transient gaps might blunt the Allies' capacity to convert collapse into operational collapse. Conversely, tolerating uncoordinated initiative could produce costly friendly fire incidents, logistical confusion, or ill-timed operations that jeopardized larger offensives. Eisenhower had to imagine not only the next week, but the next few months of coalition operations. He also had to think about precedent. A removal order would not simply address one incident. It would signal to every subordinate the limits of initiative. It would define the acceptable margin for a daring commander to act without explicit authorization. That signal could be stabilizing in preserving centralized control, or stultifying if applied too rigidly when flexibility was at a premium.
the Supreme Allied Commander's ultimate responsibility was to set the norm that best served victory. In those late March hours, Eisenhower received candid counsel from multiple quarters. Some staff urged enforcement, a clear answer that coalition procedures could not be lightly disregarded. Others urged leniency, or at least restraint, citing Patton's results and the political sensitivity of disciplining a general who had become a public symbol of American military vigor. A practical compromise, discipline without relief, gradually assumed plausibility, some form of official rebuke or administrative tightening that preserved Patton's command but forced corrective behavior. That path would strike a balance between the letter and the exigencies of the hour. When Eisenhower's reply was sent on March 28th, it reflected precisely that balancing act.
The Supreme Allied Commander declined to relieve General Patton of his command, but his refusal was not an endorsement of unmoderated initiative. Instead, it was coupled with a clear insistence that Patton improve coordination with neighboring commands and adhere to prescribed channels of communication. Eisenhower demanded immediate steps to ensure that future moves of similar consequence would be synchronized with Allied plans, and that publicity about troop movements would be managed to avoid undermining coalition unity. The reply, as reported, functioned as both a pragmatic concession and a firm administrative steer. Results mattered, but so did the framework that made coalition warfare possible. That answer surprised some and satisfied others. For Montgomery and those who shared his orientation, Eisenhower's decision felt like an evasion of principle. To them, the refusal to remove Patton represented a tolerance for conduct that could, if unchecked, erode the discipline necessary for complex, joint operations. Montgomery's resentment was not merely personal. It articulated a legitimate fear that unilateral actions, rewarded or unpunished, had the potential to distort the allocation of operational control in an alliance where national interests and professional cultures diverged. For Patton's supporters, Eisenhower's decision appeared to be a measured victory. The general would remain in command, his forces were positioned to exploit gains, the American press could continue to commend an officer who produced palpable results. The public reaction in the United States, newspaper headlines, and the tone of popular commentary tilted toward admiration for Patton's bold move. The optics mattered profoundly. American papers printed images and vignettes that fed a national narrative of decisive action. In that narrative, Eisenhower's decision to retain Patton aligned with domestic expectations about wartime leadership. Even within that immediate split of reaction, Eisenhower's management did more than simply split opinion. It established an operational compromise that sought to temper the dispute's capacity to disrupt the advance. Orders flowed to ensure clearer liaison between Patton's Third Army and Montgomery's formations to the north. Staff were instructed to tighten communication protocols and to coordinate press releases in ways less likely to produce competing narratives that could inflame national sensitivities. Eisenhower insisted that units of all commands adhere to agreed reporting lines and seek higher-level clearance for actions with potential coalition implications. Those measures were not an abstract rebuke. They were practical instruments intended to prevent the repetition of the conditions that had provoked Montgomery's complaint. The immediate military consequences were also significant. Patton's lodgment at Oppenheim was an asset. Engineers completed pontoon bridges, armor crossed, supply lines tightened. The lodgment did not create a broad strategic rupture by itself, but it accelerated the Allies' ability to project force into the German interior from the south, complementing Montgomery's northern thrust.
In the larger operational arc of late March and April 1945, both the northern and southern crossings contributed to the inexorable pressure on German defenses. The tactical lesson was plain. Audacity, when it achieved results with limited casualties and without fracturing coordination, could be tolerated and even integrated into a broader campaign. But the political and human aftershocks endured. Montgomery's irritation simmered in the months that followed, contributing to a rivalry that would linger in memoirs, dispatches, and historiography. Patton, always a polarizing figure, claimed in the eyes of many the mantle of a doer, someone willing to take his forces into the currents of combat and extract advantage. Bradley, whose authorization of the press release had helped set the sequence of events in motion, continued to occupy the middle ground, defending his subordinates' effectiveness while acknowledging the need for clearer coalition discipline. Press coverage offered an instant barometer of public sentiment. American papers favored the daring narrative, a small force crossing under cover of night, engineers throwing a bridge within hours, and armor pouring across to press a collapsing enemy. British papers, more invested in the narrative Montgomery tried to stage, took a more restrained tone, focused on the scale and meticulousness of plunder and the strategic logic behind a massed, methodical assault. That divergence in reportage was more than rhetorical. It signaled the way national audiences read the war differently, and how public readings could feed back into the conduct of commanders who were acutely conscious of reputation and legacy. Historians who later examined the episode have highlighted several enduring themes. One is the tension between discipline and initiative. The episode crystallizes a perennial command dilemma. Should commanders be punished for seizing initiative when the initiative succeeds? Another is the role of public perception. The incident reveals how press timing and national narratives can exert power over professional military judgments. A third is the difficulty of coalition command. When forces from different nations bring differing professional cultures to a common enterprise, the Supreme Allied Commander must mediate not only operations, but expectations. Scholars have debated Eisenhower's choice with nuance rather than simplistic judgment. Some argue that his decision was the pragmatic application of wartime leadership: preserve momentum, avoid damaging morale, and keep the alliance intact. Others contend that by declining to enforce discipline in a visible case, Eisenhower risked weakening the norms of coordinated action that Montgomery, with some justification, defended.
The prevailing view in much of the literature is that the Supreme Allied Commander was attempting to thread a needle, an effort to harness the strengths of both approaches while minimizing their liabilities. The episode's pedagogic value lies in the moral and institutional tensions it exposes. Leadership in wartime is not simply an exercise in choosing the morally pure option. It is a practice of weighing imperfect alternatives and choosing the path that best preserves the coalition's capacity to win. Eisenhower's refusal to remove Patton was not a dismissal of Montgomery's concerns. Rather, it was a judgment that the immediate military advantages and the political risks of removal counseled against the dramatic disciplinary step Montgomery requested. Simultaneously, Eisenhower's insistence on better coordination acknowledged that unchecked initiative could not become routine without endangering the collective effort. The human dimension of the affair also endured. Montgomery's pride was wounded. Patton's legend grew. Montgomery's mediating posture went unromanticized but was crucial. Soldiers who had manned the boats at Oppenheim returned to their units without public acknowledgment of the administrative squabbles their action had provoked. For many of them, the tactical reality, getting men, guns, and tanks across a river in time to press the advantage, was the only relevant measure.
For the commanders and their publics, the matter extended into reputations, national myth-making, and the politics of victory. Long-term judgments about the episode have been shaped by the outcome of the war itself. With Germany's collapse in May, controversies that had once seemed potentially divisive became for some historical footnotes within the larger story of Allied success. Yet the incident remained instructive for military professionals and students of leadership who see in it a compact case study in coalition management. It shows how the demands of victory often require leaders to tolerate friction and to find administrative remedies that preserve effectiveness without inviting impunity. Montgomery's insistence on discipline and Eisenhower's balancing act also shed light on differing conceptions of professionalism. Montgomery's approach emphasized rehearsed, synchronized application of force at scale with minimal risk. Patton's emphasized speed, exploitation, and resilience. Eisenhower's challenge was not merely to adjudicate between these two styles, but to integrate them where possible. The final weeks of the war demonstrated that both approaches, mass and meticulous planning, and smaller, audacious thrusts, had roles to play. The art of coalition command, Eisenhower seemed to suggest by his decision, was to retain the capacity to employ either as circumstances demanded, while erecting institutional guardrails to minimize friction. By the time the last orders were drafted, operational tempo took precedence over recriminations.
Patton continued his push. Montgomery went ahead with plunder. Both contributed to the overall squeeze on German forces that culminated in defeat. The quarrel left traces in reputations and in the contours of post-war memoirs and histories, but it did not derail the campaign. In the long sweep of interpretation, the episode is sometimes invoked as a test case. Would a commander in Eisenhower's position have enforced an abstract principle of coalition discipline at the cost of slowing a momentum that could bring the enemy to collapse? Eisenhower's answer, decline removal coupled with a demand for stricter coordination, speaks to a pragmatic calculus grounded in wartime exigency. It accepts the rough reality that in the final phase of a vast, multinational campaign, leaders must occasionally trade perfection in procedure for advantage on the ground. That trade-off was not cost-free. It left a residue of resentment and a lesson about the limits of centralized control in the field. What does the episode teach about leadership beyond its historical moment? First, that command often requires negotiating between competing goods, discipline and initiative, protocol and adaptability, alliance unity and national pride. Second, that public perception can become an operational variable, shaping decisions as surely as maps and weather. Third, that robust liaison, clear channels, and agreed norms are indispensable in alliances where different military cultures intersect. Would discipline or audacity better serve an alliance in its most decisive hours? There is no single answer that fits every moment. The Rhine episode shows why. In this case, audacity delivered a usable bridgehead with comparatively light casualties and with immediate tactical promise. Discipline demanded that the breach of coordination be redressed to protect future operations. Eisenhower's solution, a refusal to remove Patton combined with demands for improved coordination, sought to capture the value of both imperatives. As the war moved into its closing weeks, the practical tasks of supply, movement, and contact with the fleeing enemy consumed more attention than professional rankling. Historians would continue to debate the ethics and prudence of the decision. Students of leadership would cite the case as a lesson in balancing principle with consequence. The men who had pulled arduous hours on the pontoon bridges at Oppenheim and the engineers whose planks made it possible the rapid flow of armor were not much concerned about the debates above their heads. For them, the immediate measure of success was simple.
Was the bridge there when the tank needed it? In that pragmatic logic, both Patton's audacity and Montgomery's meticulous standards had contributed to the final act. Eisenhower's reply, delivered within the narrow window framed by March 22nd and March 28th, stands as a compact judgment about coalition command. It refused to make a spectacle of disciplined enforcement that might have harmed operational momentum. It refused also to grant an unfettered license to individual initiative. Instead, it nudged the alliance toward practical remedies, better coordination, clearer channels, and a recognition that leadership must sometimes accommodate exceptional personalities when results are at stake. Which leadership style would you trust when the stakes are as high as the Allied push across the Rhine? Methodical control that minimizes risks through massed application, or audacious initiative that seizes fleeting advantage? That question has no universally correct answer. It depends on context, temperament, and what a commander is trying to achieve. In late March 1945, Eisenhower judged that the path to victory required retaining the capacity for both, while making sure the next time an audacious move occurred, it would be marshaled into the alliance's broader purpose, rather than become a cause for division. If this episode of Wartime Command leaves you with questions about leadership, coalition politics, or the role of press and perception in military affairs, share your thoughts below and tell us which command style you think the Allies needed most in 1945. And if you want a deeper look at Patton's audacity or Montgomery's planning, subscribe and watch our next deep dive where we unpack their careers and the campaigns that defined them.